Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Thank you very much for tuning in this morning. Joining us on the phones right now to talk about not only the Texas legislative session, but also I think we're going to talk a little bit about 2022, as that's going to make some headlines here in Texas. The editor of Quorum Report, Scott Braddock, joining us here on the Chad Hasty Show. Scott, good morning. How are you?
I think your count is low on how many Democrats are going to be running. 85?
Oh, yeah.
I've got it's exponentially growing every day.
Yeah, it seems to be.
I know you meant 2020 also, but when you said 2022, I thought, I can't even get that far out. 2022 was...
We'll get there at some point.
I'm trying to get through this legislative session, and, it's talk about 2020. It's talk about 2021, which is going to be redistricting around here. We'll get into that later in later shows, but, looking down the road, it's going to get rough.
Oh yeah. Well, let's I guess start off with 2020, because that was one of the big stories over the weekend, at least here in Texas. Yeah. Julian Castro announcing his intention to run for president.
Huge deal. 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. Julian Castro, the former HUD secretary and mayor of San Antonio, laid out the following things, and then you tell me. Let's play where they fall on the ideological spectrum in the Democratic Party. He laid out these things: free community college tuition for everybody, revamping of the cash bail system, Medicare for all, and green initiatives to protect the environment. Do you think we're talking about a more moderate Democrat or a more liberal Democrat?
It sounds like to me we're going a little left here.
Yeah, in fact, the Dallas Morning News, in their news coverage just said he sounds as liberal as they come. And this, probably indicates what's happening in the overall Democratic Party. They're moving more to the left. Before the announcement, the Texas Republican Party chairman, James Dickey, had a conference call for journalists. I was on that, and he was talking about the race to be more liberal than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I don't know that Julian Castro is that far left. But look, the Democratic Party is going through is sort of the same thing that the Republican Party went through when it had, a dry spell of winning presidential races. How many times did you hear and probably participate in the conversations where folks would talk about why John McCain lost to Obama or why Romney lost to Obama? How many times did you hear this comment? It's because they were not conservative enough. Well, over in the Democratic Party, it's just the flip of that. It's the photo negative, really, where you have Democrats who are arguing that the reason that Hillary Clinton lost to Trump in some ways is because she was not liberal enough. I know that Republicans would laugh at that, but maybe it's because she was not populist enough. Steve Bannon, who was at Breitbart and helped Trump get elected, I think he was probably right when he said that, the real argument in American politics and politics around the world going forward is probably going to be centered around populism, which is certainly where Trump finds himself politically, but he's more on the right side of populism, and you're going to have some of these more left-wing populists trying to take him on from the other side.
Yeah. What is as far as when you look at someone like Castro, who nationally, maybe a few years ago, had more of a national brand or a national ID, to me, he kind of lost that moment to run if you were going to run. What's his lane in this? I mean, how does he clinch a nomination in a field that's going to have some awfully big names?
Yeah, and, really I think the number is more like 30 or 35 Democrats at this point. It looks like Hollywood Squares times 7. You have of the liberal lane. You also have the Latino lane. There's a lot of identity politics going on here, quite frankly, and I don't know if that's good or bad, but I think that's what's going on. I mean, during the announcement, you saw where there were Hispanics saying, in a very excited way, saying that somebody who looks like their father or looks like their husband or brother is about to announce for president. That's something that's very exciting. Among that group, I think that it's still sort of taken for granted by some Democrats that Hispanics will naturally vote for someone who's more liberal or somebody who's more Democratic. If you poll folks in the Hispanic community, and we see this in our elections in Texas, there's still a significant number of Hispanics who vote for Republicans because a lot of folks are, within that group are, pro-life, they're pro-gun, they're anti-gay marriage, etc. And if you poll those folks, they break down much like the population at large. It's not a monolithic thing. It's not that all Hispanics are Democratic or Republican. They break down pretty evenly on some of the issues that I named, and so it's not so much that they would just naturally vote for Democrats, but for Republicans to win among those folks, they really have to be talking to them and speaking to their issues. I do think that where the president is on the issue of illegal immigration and border security probably drives a lot of them to the Democratic side, but that doesn't always have to be the case going forward.
Yeah. So when we look at, and this is going to be a very interesting primary for Texas, because if Beto O'Rourke announces that he's running for president, you're going to have two Democrats in Texas with name ID who are running for president on the Democrat side, which is very rare. But the battle for, I guess, Texas and Texas Democrats between an O'Rourke and a Castro, how do you see that playing out?
Well, and there's a reason that the Castros took a pass on running for any statewide office in Texas this past year. Beto O'Rourke got into the race, and as you said there, it may be that Castro's moment has sort of passed here. Of course, there's a long way to go until the actual voting gets underway in the Democratic primary and then the general election for 2020. But we talked about this during the conference call with Republican Party Chairman Dickey, who, he said it's absolutely the case that he and others feel, and, this is probably some of the thinking within the Castro campaign too, that if Castro is going to make a serious run for the presidency, he needs to be in and announce earlier than some of these other folks because he does maybe have a Beto problem. If Beto O'Rourke decides to get into the race, he's got an infrastructure here in Texas, a Democratic infrastructure, to put those voters together on his side, and he's also got a huge fundraising infrastructure. I mean, the kind of numbers that he was able to put together with small donations from not just people in Texas but from around the country as well, kind of astronomical fundraising. And so I think that Castro certainly falls in at least the second tier of those 30 or 35 Democrats who may be running.
And O'Rourke also has Oprah.
He does.
That's pretty good.
He has Oprah, and I think Castro will probably be sitting on Oprah's couch as well pretty soon. Yeah, that's kind of how these campaigns work.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Well, let's take a look.
That's of course that's assuming Oprah doesn't get into the race herself.
That would absolutely change it.
Yes, the others might just want to clear the field if that happens.
You think Oprah's going to? Is this what Oprah's doing? Holding interviews for her VP? Is that what she's going to use it for?
Anytime somebody says they're not running for something and they have to keep saying it over and over again, keep your antenna up.
Yeah, absolutely. We're visiting with Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report, right now. Let's take a look at the legislature. A look back last week. Take us through last week, what happened, and then what we're going to be seeing moving forward.
Last week was sort of an attempt by the governor, lieutenant governor, and the new speaker to try to show a unified front about the two issues that we talked about here on the show last week, and those, of course, are school finance and property taxes. But if you listen to some of the things that were being said by the big three, if you will, it seemed like there is some nuance to this. It seems like the House, where Dennis Bonnen is the new speaker, they're more interested in school finance and fixing the way that Texas public schools are paid for. And on the other side of the building, in the Texas Senate, where Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is the presiding officer, it sounds more like property tax reform is what's going to be driving the narrative. Now, of course, as we discussed, these things are joined at the hip, and it was retiring Speaker Joe Strauss who had started to make the case over the last 2 years that if you really want to reduce people's property taxes, then you need to completely rebuild from the ground up the way that schools are paid for. It was interesting to me that you had a press conference at the governor's mansion last week that I attended where the big three, Patrick and Abbott and Bonnen, all came together to show that unified front. And Chad, in a funny sort of way, they kind of made the case that this has never happened before, that all the big three showed unity at the beginning of the legislative session and came together for a press conference like this. Well, one thing is that I think they felt like they had to have that press conference, all three of them together, because Patrick was not even there on the first day of the legislature. He was off in Washington, of course, as we reported, helping the president with his border security speech. If he had not been in Washington, all three of them probably would have been seen together on the opening day of the legislative session, because the governor always goes to both the House and Senate to give a little bit, not a huge speech, but a little speech to the members to tell them some of what his priorities are going to be. And of course, moving into this week, they will have the inauguration, where the governor will lay out more of his priorities in his inaugural speech. Dan Patrick will do the same thing in his speech. And we'll see where we go from there. But during the last week, it was really sort of the Speaker's show, because he had, given his first big address as Speaker of the House. He got emotional when he talked about being a dyslexic kid from a small town in Texas, from Angleton, Texas, where they don't necessarily have resources for kids who are in public schools, especially those with a disability like he had. And so that's what he was using to, sort of frame up the argument about giving more resources to schools all across the state. So school finance and property taxes, definitely the focus. These guys are now building up these relationships that they may later tear down when they don't agree about how to get these things done.
Yeah, that's one thing that I even mentioned last week is I wonder how long the kumbaya moments will last, because it is they're trying to present this united front, but you're right. You had the speaker who even printed up, specialized cups, right?
Yeah.
Talking about school finance. Meanwhile, it appears as though Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, he wants to focus on giving teachers that the $10,000 raise over time, I guess, is what he's been talking about as far as school finance goes. But he's really focused on, it seems, property tax reform.
Yeah.
So they're going to clash at some point.
They will, and it's not that anybody is rooting for them to clash at some point. Although, as political journalists here in Austin, we're known to be fight promoters. But look, it's not that they want to disagree or that they want to clash. It's just what happens when you don't end up agreeing about how to do something. And it very well may be the case that they do genuinely want to address these issues in a way that is serious. But as it's cliche to say it, but the devil's in the details, especially when you're dealing with issues as complex as property taxes in Texas and the way that we fund public education.
Visiting with Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. You can go to quorumreport.com. Scott, one issue that I guess it could have come up during the session, it's not going to now, was that plaque that was removed over the weekend, it looks like.
Yeah, it was this plaque that was about the Civil War, and it was just flat wrong in its assertions about the cause of the Civil War. It said that the Civil War's underlying cause was not slavery, and all of the Republican leadership agreed that it was inaccurate and offensive. It took months for it to be taken down after it was sort of first protested by a Democratic state representative from Dallas. Over the weekend, a Republican named Jeff Leach from Plano, who was just recently installed as the newest member of the State Preservation Board, he took some heat from Tea Party activists in Tarrant County, who called him some names that I'm not going to repeat on the radio, but that, they said he was basically placating the left by voting to take down this plaque. By the way, the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker all voted the same way, but I didn't see them taking heat. But look, like we talked about with the Democrats sort of eating their own in the Democratic primary, which is going to heat up, sooner than later. Sort of the same thing goes on in the Republican Party. We've seen the infighting forever, and it seems like those who have been more Tea Party-style lawmakers, this is sort of happening under the surface. I think that they're getting a little tired of some of what they hear from some of the grassroots in the Republican Party. Not all grassroots, of course, but the element that is more sympathetic to some of the hate groups and racist groups out there. And it seems like the Republicans are ready to push back against that.
Interesting. I guess before we let you go, it sort of emerged, I guess, because of the lieutenant governor going to Washington, D.C. last week. It's kind of emerged that the lieutenant governor is kind of the point guy for President Trump in Texas. Is that normal? Is that a normal relationship where it's not the governor, it's not even really the two senators, it's the lieutenant governor?
The lieutenant governor of this state has always been, Dan Patrick has always been, I think, of the big three leaders, the best at reading the political landscape. During the presidential primary, as soon as Senator Cruz, who Patrick had been supporting until that point, as soon as Cruz was no longer an option in the presidential primary, Dan Patrick ran straight to the Trump camp, and in fact, he was key in convincing Cruz it was time to get on board with the Trump train and endorse the eventual president. And the governor, not as close to Trump, the speaker certainly not close to Trump at all, but Dan Patrick was his campaign chairman here in Texas, and he was with him on the border last week on Thursday to talk about the need for a wall, as he sees it, in certain places along the Texas-Mexico border. And look, you've got an interesting relationship between these guys. It may be that Dan Patrick is the guy who could give Trump a roadmap on how to claim victory, even though, his border wall, the way he originally described it, may be defeated this year. I mean, look, Patrick's the guy who's been claiming victory on bathrooms, even though his bathroom bill went down in defeat in 2017, and so maybe Trump could take a page out of that playbook.
Yeah, very interesting. Scott, tell folks about Quorum Report.
People can check us out at quorumreport.com. Sign up for our free emails there. We'll let you know what's happening at the legislature in real time as the legislative session unfolds. Sign up at quorumreport.com.
All right, and then follow Scott on Twitter at Scott Braddock, where he talks about scooters, walls, and a lot of other stuff.
Well, you can still ride the scooters in Austin, just not on the Capitol grounds, Chad.
I'll
rat you out.
Man.
I will rat you out when you're here.
All right, Scott, I'll talk to you later. Have a good one.
Yes, sir. Talk soon.
That's Scott Braddock of Quorum Report, quorumreport.com. They won't allow scooters on the Capitol grounds. Come on.